make some introductory comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to find out a little bit more about who is in the room. I know Chris is from New Zealand. Is there anyone else here that's from a country outside of the U.S.? Raise your hand. Okay, why don't you just yell out real quick what country that is. Start over here. Canada.
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 Bermuda.
Where? Bermuda? Awesome. In Canada. Anything else? Any other nations represented? How many of you are architects? Any architects here? How about housing, affordable housing developers? All right, okay. How many of you are community design folks? You're urbanist types, okay. How many are like into the intentional Christian movement and reputational movement? All right, great, good. How many from this state? Oh, good, good. And I'm actually from California. I want to know if there's other Californians. I know there's a few of us. All right. Yeah, why don't we just quickly yell out any other states between California and this state? Just go start at this end. What states are you from? Alabama? Where? Virginia? Georgia? Connecticut? Illinois? Florida?
Tennessee.
What was that?
Tennessee.
Tennessee.
Missouri.
Missouri.
South Carolina.
South Carolina. All right. Anything else? We missed any states?
Massachusetts. Ohio.
Indiana. Louisiana. Man, we have an awesome representation here. I'm very excited. Thanks, everybody, for making the effort to come here today. It's going to be a great time. Today we gather as a participatory first step toward an official Christian Community Development Association best practice resource. And this is for Christian housing ministries or any ministry or any Christian, any kind of housing work. This is going to be incredibly helpful, whether you're part of a community of faith or not. So to help us arrive at some of these best practices, we have experts that are here on this table from 10 different housing sectors. They'll all be presenting in this, what's called a Pecha Kucha. It's a type of presentation. So hold on to your seats. It's going to go fast. You need to give your full attention. After that, we're going to have 2 breakout sessions. And in between those 2 breakout sessions, we'll have a reminder of the core 8 principles of CCDA. So if you're not part of CCDA, you'll have a chance to get a little 15-minute connection around that. So first, in thinking about our day, we need to consider what is a best practice. Often we use that term, but we don't really think about what it means. So before we define best practice, let's just talk about what a practice is. So a practice is basically, it's a condition arrived at by experience or exercise. So it alludes to an environment. It's something that's practiced, okay? You need to keep that in mind. And so it also alludes to an environment that flourishes, that causes growth and wholeness. And that's really the theme of this conference. It's talking about flourishing and thriving. So today we're aiming to know those practices. And we're really looking at our collective experiences today. That's why it's a participatory process. We're not just looking at concepts or ideas, we're looking at those experiences and practices that we've lived, and all of us in this room will seek to discern and share what some of those best practices might be. So we're not just talking about any practice, we're really talking about best practices. And so what makes them best? So typically, a best practice has some of the following qualities. It's effective, it produces successful outcomes, it has potential for replication, and it's long-term and has sustainable impact. So it's not, it could be a method, a technique, but it's something that's consistently shown results that are superior to those achieved by other beings. And also a best practice can become better. So it can improve with time as more improvements are discovered. And then our collective wisdom today, this really is kind of a sacred first step, a time that we're setting aside for actually some unlikely folks to come together and to really seek to hear each other. Let me explain what I mean by unlikely. How many of you who work in the design community that are some of those intentional, or let's say community design, looking at new urbanist ideas, how many of you have actually sat down with folks that are working on homeless issues? Okay, so you've actually sat down and listened and talked together around those. Okay. In my city, that doesn't happen. In Pasadena, there's rarely any connection. How many of you who are affordable housing developers have sat down with any extensive time with affordable housing advocates? Have actually sat down with the advocates and really listened to their concerns? And again, in my community, the advocates rarely have a connection with the developers. So these connections, at least in California, we tend to be siloed and there's not a lot of connection. And I think that what we'll find out is that there's a lot that we have in common, but there's also a lot of things that we hold in tension. And oftentimes we don't talk about them. So let me explain more of what I mean. One more thing I want to say about today. When I was working on my doctorate ministry with Ray Bakke, Ray was constantly talking about a practice, reflection, practice methodology. And I love that. And I think that that's really what we're doing today. We're actually exercising a best practice by coming today and doing a practice, reflection, practice model. And then to drill down on some specific, well, Myra Nolan, she'll be coming during the break. I think I mentioned she'll be talking about the 8 core principles of CCDA. But in order to drill down on the heart of very specific practices that have to do with housing, let me just frame our discussion with a few examples. I'm going to give 2 biblical examples, and I'm going to give 2 kind of historical examples. When you look at Jesus, he consistently lifted up those that are on the margins, the rejected social classes. He was always bringing the outsider in, be it fishermen, tax collectors, widows whose homes were devoured, the woman at the well who had 5 husbands, those who were demon-possessed and more. So this idea that Jesus had of always bringing hope and healing and purpose and a plan for redemption of the city with those that are unlikely and those on the margins. And oftentimes those unlikely folks are the ones that, if they share their story with those at the city council or at the state or even the federal level, there's a real power there of empowerment and transformation. There may be some people here and their best practices, they may not utilize that model where people on the margins have a chance to be brought in and given a chance to participate. So that's a best practice perhaps that might be discussed. Since the early 1900s, there's been many different experiments that our U.S. government has had around housing. And if you start clear back with, welcome. We start clear back with Jane Addams and the whole house in Chicago. How many here from Chicago? Anyone? Just a couple of you guys, all right. Well, I love Chicago. But Jane Addams started with her team counting the number of deaths. They intentionally moved into the community and they became the first social workers. And they counted the number of people who died, the different types of diseases. And as they began to pull all this information together and realize that part of the problem was the lack of ventilation. So that resulted in the very first building codes we ever had in our country, right about 1900. So if you know, the building codes, you add more building codes and you add more expense. And as the expense increased, that's when government had to finally step in and get involved. One more thing I want to mention about Jane Addams. She and her cohort, as I mentioned, they lived in the community. They respected the dignity of those that they lived among. They valued their culture and their skills. They created a safe place where even the poor were involved in teaching courses among their traditional weaving, their languages, in order to retain their culture. So the world recognized that these were some best practices. They gave Jane a Nobel Peace Prize for her work, and these same kind of settlement communities started all across the US. And some aspects of CCDA actually have adopted many of these ideas as best practices. So, as I mentioned, the cost of housing was increasing. The government realized they had to somehow step in, and that's when public housing was introduced in 1937, and it was initially proposed to be a mixed income community, and that way the rent structure would make it sustainable. But the building association bought this, and they did not want the government to be involved in building any kind of market rate housing. So now, 75 years later, public housing structures have been deemed, many of them, have been deemed as failures and torn down and redeveloped with the initial best practice idea of a mixed income with Hope 6. And so perhaps these best practices are finally getting realized. But then are they? You know, at what cost? And how can we really determine whether a public housing project should indeed be torn down or not? How much listening has taken place to those who actually live there? We all want to have all kinds of decisions made about our homes and where we live, and sometimes that listening piece isn't taking place among those living in public housing. How many of those have ended up in the homeless ministries that we are involved in? So we need to think about these kinds of questions. What side of the equation would Jesus be on if you're considering what to do with a public housing? When you consider environmental practices of public housing that's torn down, maybe there's some kind of adaptive reuse to reutilize some of those materials in order to preserve that construction. Lots of decisions that we need to consider as we're grappling with these issues. And can public housing, those that exist that are still really the most affordable housing in our nation, can it still really thrive? There's one model of a community developer who, at one end of the public housing, they were talking and finding the assets of those that live there, and she said, "I am the best cook. You will not find a cook better than me." And so at the other end, here's another woman. She says, "I'm the best cook." So they were able to get these two women together, and they started a catering business. And some thriving businesses began to take place within this public housing. So in Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15, it's interesting. Those two chapters basically summarize some of the Old Testament Sabbath economic laws with heartfelt commands that talk about how to treat the poor and the foreigner as your brother, and to share freely. So the purpose of these laws and commands, it's very clear. This purpose is stated so that there be no poor among you. So that was actually fulfilled by the early church. Within that area in Acts chapter 4, there was no poor among them. And so if eliminating poverty is our goal, if we're trying to create no poor among us, then that needs to be reflected in our best practices. Too often our ministries are maintaining poverty, and we aren't really getting at ending poverty. And I think you'll, especially when we hear Lloyd and some others today in the Housing First projects, we're going to, Housing First, we'll hear about some of that. So today, in some cases, you may even think about the whole profession of social work that Jane Addams started over 100 years ago, and we love that profession. We need social workers. We also need to consider how perhaps some of our social workers and some of those ministers working in our community may be involved in maintaining poverty without realizing it. There's times when social workers come into communities, they have a nice salary, and then they leave those communities and they live out into another community. And so how much money is there really going in to develop that community sometimes with those models? At times, sometimes with social workers, I know 3 pastors in Pasadena that live an hour away from their community, and they can't afford to live close to where their church is. So what could perpetuate sometimes is kind of a disempowered underclass, and without really creating the indigenous leadership needed in those communities. And we'll be hearing about that in relation to CCDA. The kind of indigenous leadership that we want to develop are like those 2 women that created that catering business. So a possible best practice might be to mitigate those kind of tendencies. One quick example in closing, perhaps there would be some kind of a community benefits agreement when developments come in to make sure that at least 10% or 20% of the people that work on that housing project that are developers actually live in that community. Maybe part of the staff, a requirement that they actually live in the target community, where maybe 50 to 20 or 50% of the materials would come from that local community, as well as other contracts and services and labor. So here we have a whole mix of questions and ideas that we're going to grapple with today. Some folks that typically wouldn't be getting together. And hopefully we'll be seeking a place where we can be really honest and really share. And there may be some conflicting goals. I think it's interesting when you look at ending poverty and creating hospitality and creating safety. Those 3 goals, they're wonderful goals, but sometimes they very much can be in conflict. So, so we're honored to have these experts. We're very excited to hear about their work. And I want to invite you to read their bios and really give them your full attention and be thinking about the kinds of questions that will help us get at some of the best practices. So thank you.
Thank you, Jill, and special thanks to Kevin Campbell, who suggested that I might be interested in participating in this event. I'd never heard of the Christian Community Development Association before. So Pecha Kucha, I have never done one of these, and I'm sure I'm going to fumble it too, but I do have my iPhone set up to play. In 5 seconds it's going to start, and then I'll start asking the slides to move forward. So, do the countdown. Bang. 5, 4. Okay, so I've got to tell you about myself in just a little bit of time. So, I've been in the business of affordable housing for 40 years. I went to college from 1967 to 1971. I was very active in the Vietnam War protest movement with moratoriums. During that time, I also saw the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And out of that experience came a commitment on my part to work towards social justice and social equity. I would say that it wasn't necessarily faith-based, but it's something that I think has been part of my DNA, my wife's DNA, and my children's DNA since then. Next slide, please. We're on DHIC. Okay, good. How'd that happen? Did it do it automatically or not? Is it? Okay, you're doing it. All right. Geez, I'm already 1 slide behind. All right, so DHIC has been around since 1974. We're a private, nonprofit organization formed by the city of Raleigh. We originally worked in low and moderate income neighborhoods surrounding the downtown. Our name was Downtown Housing Improvement Corporation, but now we've kind of expanded to be a regional producer, focusing on real estate development. There we go. 40 years, I mentioned. We now own 2,100 apartments across 37 different communities. We have 700 seniors that live in our communities. We also have a home ownership center that you hear about a little bit later that provides counseling to folks. Moving ahead. We build housing, and we serve really as a real estate developer that takes development from the beginning to the very end. So we conceptualize what we're doing, hire the team, and the like. Okay, now I'm telling you about my people here, and I'm going to keep moving on my Pecha Kucha. Again, I mentioned 2,200 adults. We're serving seniors. We're serving those with 85% of our folks are less than 50% of AMI. Average income for our families is about $20,000 a year. For our seniors is about $15,000 a year. Now, a lot of what we do is complicated, and this kind of gives you a chart of how we build a lot of our rental housing. And that we use federal low-income housing tax credits and lots of other layers of financing. And it's kind of both for-profit developers and nonprofit developers do this. These tax credit developments require a lot of paper. We just have tons of lawyers working with us and accountants. And it also requires money, soft money, a lot of it. And that comes from the city, county, or state. When we do our work, it's often a 5-year period of time from that initial conceptualization before we ever get complete. So there's a lot of patience, perseverance, and faith. I mean, we persevere, and we just got to keep the faith going. A couple of examples are forthcoming here shortly. This is Highland Terrace in Cary, North Carolina. This is a seniors community, part of a 278-unit community that we did for very low-income seniors. This has 80 apartments. Out of this, we had a $9 million total development cost. $5 million of that came from equity from tax credit syndications. We had $3 million worth of soft financing. Rents are averaging around $600 a month for this complex. Brookridge Apartments is a senior housing first model, SRO housing for men and women coming out of the shelters, substance abuse, recovery programs, and the like. This is our second such development. 41 student apartments were here, and that had a lot of soft assistance. We've also done renovation work. Here's an example of that in downtown Raleigh, where we took it down to the studs and put totally new systems in the 63-unit apartment community. You know, I think that there are many ways that we can turn to the faith community. Some of you are developers and the like, and you've got your own organizations. But we also see that there's a tremendous need to provide support assistance to our residents, both our seniors, who obviously are becoming frail over time, single men and women in our SRO type housing and the like. We do work with a number of different groups to provide after-school programming, food pantries, cosmetology, wellness, and the like, mentoring. And we've obviously seen a lot of work with faith-based groups in the homeless realm. Providing transitional housing, feeding sites, and the like. I think another really hugely important aspect for the faith community is in the realm of advocacy. That your voices as members of the community can add so much more than those who are professional housers. And we have seen some of that effectiveness here in Raleigh. We have Congregations for Social Justice that has been working with trying to illuminate issues before City Council and the like, and I think that they bring a lot of credibility and a lot of impact in Wake County. Now, obviously, there's really no single answer to solving housing problems. We try and just push things along and do the best we can. It costs money to produce housing. We can't just solve everybody's housing problems with tiny houses or some technology. It does require public assistance of some kind. You know, I want to learn more about you all, and I look forward to doing that this afternoon in your interest, but you know, we certainly want to follow what you're doing and learn more about it. I don't think we're taking any questions at this point, but our website is dhic.org if you'd like to learn more about ours. Thanks.
Jill Shook is kind of bounced up here. And by the way, I think you did a great job for your first Coochie Coochie presentation. You got to talk fast, you got to deliver the content, and you got the images, and it just goes bing, bing, bing. And so we're on the next one that Jill's going to present. She's the indomitable Jill Shook, the author of this book here on faith-based housing. And without further ado, thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Chris. I've got to go way down here. My husband is Anthony, and he's going to help click through for me. I put the title, What's Faith Got to Do with It? And I think you could easily say, what's love got to do with it? I think we're all doing a great labor of love here in this room today. Whether we know it or not, or whether we have faith in Christ, or we just are simple visionaries that have a commitment to a better world, we all exercise faith in many, many ways. As a Christian, it takes faith to believe and to realize that the kingdom of God is now. To imagine that a community that will be adequately housed, and to invest in land when others dare not, and also to create an economic system that provides access to the poor, and to believe in the power of the church and the voice of the homeless to create housing, affordable housing, and to trust in the power of community to take the ownership of the land, the neighborhood, the economics, and the laws of the land. So first, it takes faith to realize God's kingdom now. In the midst of occupation, while Israel was exiled from Babylon, the last place that they ever wanted to be, that they ever dreamed and imagined they would be, this was a promise that God gave to them. They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. No longer will they build houses while others live in them. And then when we look at the prayer, for those of us that go to church, the prayer that we often hear, the Lord's Prayer, and Jesus says, as he taught us how to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Too often we think all this is going to be great once we get to heaven. And God has given us a very exciting opportunity here on earth now. In Eastern Washington State, Ralph and Cheryl Brogy, I deeply admire them. They've created a little piece of heaven here on earth. They have an apple farm, the largest in the world, family owned, with about 1,200 workers. And they realized that the housing conditions were just beyond belief that their workers were in. And so they took $5 million out of their business and they created 150 single-family homes, making sure they were all affordable. And they're able to now save. So many of those families that work for them are now able to buy their own homes. Secondly, it takes faith to imagine a community where all are adequately housed. This is Chad Switters from North Minneapolis with Urban Homeworks. And this group of folks, anyone here from that ministry in Minneapolis? No, I thought we'd have folks here today. They actually believe it's possible to reweave the economic, spiritual, and social vitality of an under-resourced community with housing for everyone, and they're making it happen. It's very powerful. Thirdly, it takes faith to invest in land when no one else will. So when you look at Jeremiah, in that time of history when Jerusalem was in shambles, God commanded him to buy property. And so it was really a sign of hope. He says this, Jeremiah says, so I bought a field at Anatoth. The God of Israel says, someday people will again own property here in this land, and they will buy and sell houses. So I think that same kind of promise, CCDA is committed to working in under-resourced communities. And Ray Stransky, who I deeply admire in Denver, he bought property in a place, he partnered in a place where nobody else would. He developed this beautiful mixed income, mixed use corner of Denver's 5 Points. He dared to invest when no one else would and found very difficult, many layers of funding in order to pull this off. This is what he says, for-profit developers would jump at the chance to do projects such as The Point if they were easy or relatively profitable. Next, it takes faith to create an economic system that provides access for the poor. Dr. John Perkins, our CCDA founder and hero, he created food co-ops in Mississippi, and then when he found that the kids were malnourished, and then he created medical and then housing co-ops. So he essentially was creating a system within a system with a larger system that brought a level of justice. My husband, Anthony, is a Quaker, and I really admire their work. They created something in the Central Valley of California called Self-Help Enterprises. And it was a sweat equity system enabling immigrant families who pick our food from the nation's bread basket there in the Central Valley of California. And it's a model where 12 to 15 families come together, they build homes, They all help each other. No one can move in until all the homes are completed. So in the process, these farm workers develop all kinds of skills. They become electricians, carpenters. Over 5,000 homes were built in the Central Valley using this model. And so the Quakers helped to pass policy so that today, under the Rural Housing Department, in small communities across the nation, they can access funding for self-help housing. It was Millard Fuller that came to the Central Valley and began to study this model. And he began to learn from the Quakers and imagine an economic system where it was possible to have access to housing. He developed what he calls the economics of Jesus, which include not making profit off the poor or charging interest for the poor and many other things. Next, it takes faith to believe in the power of the church and the voice of the homeless to create housing. Beacon Interfaith in Minneapolis, I love what they're doing. They have the faith in the capacity of the church to help finance and approve and build affordable housing. What they do is, this is Nicollet Square. It's one of 19 apartment buildings that they have developed in partnership with churches and congregations by creating teams within a church. And those teams, together with Beacon Interfaith, research the need, develop the vision, secure the financing, and or participate in the construction. I'm running a little late, I can see, with my Pecha Kucha, so I'm going to skip this one. I hate to skip it. I don't know. Do I have a minute? Okay. I'm not used to this presentation style. Okay, so Hollywood Presbyterian Church, the Lord's Lighthouse. What they did is they were able to organize the homeless and did surveys in their community, and they developed hard research. And because they had research with their data, they were able then to have a voice. They were able to create affordable housing in their community by working with their city councilmen, and some of them were appointed as commissioners, city commissioners, and the homeless actually coordinated all kinds of advocacy efforts, which helped to pass Prop 46 in California. That was a $2.1 billion state financing bond, all for affordable housing. So lastly, it takes faith to trust in the power of community to take ownership of the neighborhood, the economics, the buildings, the land, and the laws of the land. Sister Lucienne Pullen, in the state of Maine, she bused the homeless in their shelters to the state capitol to help change the laws, enabled community land trusts to exist in their state. Today, some of those homeless families that helped to coordinate these and change this law are now getting to live in the homes they helped in a community land trust. And they really take seriously this whole idea that the land ultimately belongs to God. While attending a Bible study in their building, some of the residents that lived in this building that you see at the top, it was gang controlled, and they believed that it just might be possible to take ownership of their building. After lawsuits against the owner for building neglect, they actually became the owners, and they partnered with the city and with tax credits, and they've been able to create what was an eyesore into a monument to God's glory. Then I'm going to close out with this. In South Bronx churches, they created a culture of faith and the relational power of congregations to transform their community. They created over 1,000 homes in South Bronx and investing in a time when nobody else would. Sarah Plowden, who's one of the homeowners, said this: "We did more than buy homes, we bought into one another as a people." None of these homes during the entire foreclosure meltdown have gone into foreclosure. And it was interesting, the churches really became the catalyst to bring the investment back to South Bronx and into what was viewed as a nation's burned out city beyond redemption. So what does faith have to do with it? Everything. Thanks.
It was my idea to do this Pecha Kucha thing. So, so there is grace on the timing. Just a little bit of grace. So, but that was a great presentation, and we have now a friend of mine. I'm on the board of the Congress for New Urbanism, and I want to introduce Kristen Jeffers, who is a member of the Congress for New Urbanism and a fantastic person to boot. Come and contribute your content to this gathering. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. And obviously, my slides look a little bit different than I had them when I made them. So, New Urbanism is supposed to be bigger than me, right? And it is. Obviously, I definitely feel that this is part of my calling, and you'll see that as we go through the slides. And that's my website. You can go on there and kind of look at the work specifically on sort of what I'm going to talk about today. And what I'm going to talk about, what's written in your program is actually, it says smart growth. What I'm going to talk about is new urbanism. They're sort of related, but somewhat different. New urbanism is actually, it consists of 27 tenets. And you can go ahead to the next slide. And just, we can kind of hang here. And these are words, I pulled together this word wall. If you've heard of new urbanism, you may have heard it. It's just sort of motivating sort of this back to downtown movement that you're seeing developers do. I mean, really, especially here in downtown Raleigh, I'm sure some of you who live in a bigger city, some of you who've seen old warehouses suddenly become apartment buildings for young people, or, just the idea that we need more transit, all these things that are coming around that. But a lot of us have been doing this for years. We've been in the communities, we've been in the inner city, this is part of our ministry, and so some of these words have actually come out of the Charter for New Urbanism, which is the main tenets, some of those 27 tenets that we observe as new urbanists. And I picked these words because they also line up with a lot of what we do as Christian community developers. And we can move ahead. These are some of the founders and sort of key leaders. Over here on the left, you have Andreas Duaney, who is pretty much, revered as the, ringleader. But the movement has obviously grown. Up above him this is first what they were building, and if they were building at a people scale and at an actual scale that people could get in. And, there were concerns about affordable housing. I put former Housing Secretary Henry Cicerones there. He actually worked with the CNU to build the Hope 6 program, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and it ties back more into sort of more traditional affordable housing and community development activities. This was a picture that was shot in 2012. I actually am not in this photograph because I woke up a little too late, but this is at our 20th Congress in West Palm Beach. And as you can see, there's a lot of people here. This was supposed to be a group photo, but obviously I'm not there. There are so many people that are in this movement now that aren't in this picture. This is an international movement. There are people who live overseas and are doing new urbanism work, and they also have, we also have the Charter Awards, and there are international winners of that. So you're looking at a movement that's very diverse. This is Seaside. Seaside is a community in Florida. It was one of the first sort of quote-unquote new urbanist communities. And you may be familiar with this community if you watched The Truman Show. It was set there. They used that as the backdrop for this quote-unquote perfect community. The thing is with this community is that it is very unaffordable for many people. This is a beach community. This is a community that is a community of second homes. It's almost that people come here to get away from what they're normally doing. But this is Willow Oaks. This is a community in Greensboro. This is a Hope 6 community. This is mixed income, Section 8 housing, also just market rate housing. It is not built out to the level that it probably could be, but it replaced a very devastated public housing community, Morningside Homes. Those of you who are local may be familiar with that. I put this image of the urban church here because, this is,